Today's episode continues our look at the analysing argument component of VCE English and EAL, and our focus today is going to be primarily on arguments. So, what are arguments? Well, they are the reasons which support the author's contention. They are also sequenced in a specific order, and this is done to convince their target audience. They're also often categorized as either ethos, logos, or pathos, meaning they relate to the author's credibility, the audience's sense of logic and reason, and I guess their emotions as well. And with arguments, they are quite often an idea or potentially the perspective or position of the author in relation to their contention. So, how do we find arguments? Well, the first thing we need to do is to find the author's contention. This is the key that will unlock the arguments. Try to work out the reasons for the author's contention. Now, if you're having trouble with this, my advice is to add the word because on the end of the contention. For example, the author believes that pill testing should be legalized because it saves lives. That could be an argument. Because it's been used in other countries effectively. Could be another one, just as an example. Now, if you are still struggling locating arguments, try and break up the article into paragraphs and work out what the author is talking about. Potentially, you could even look at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the article and work out what the author is discussing in these three sections. So how do we analyse these arguments? Well, the first thing to think about is how are they structured and whether there is a pattern or a sequence in which they're ordered. Think about how the author begins the article. Is it done to shock the reader, or perhaps it's an emotive beginning? Have a think about how they finish the article as well. Quite often you will find authors finish on a call to action. They compel or encourage their readers or their audience to act on the issue at hand. Also, think about whether they complement or contradict the arguments in the other texts, bearing in mind that comparison is a really important part of the analysing argument sack. And lastly, have a think about the shifts within the article. Does the audience change, or does the author change their tone in the different arguments? So when writing about arguments, our topic sentences are crucial. This is where we'll be able to outline the arguments within an article. Now make sure you use vocabulary that stipulates the structure. Here are some phrases which you might find useful. Continues, furthers, after, following, subsequently, opens, closes, and establishes. And these are just some of many. Speaking of vocab, verbs are really important to ensure that we clearly state the arguments. So my three favourite ones are asserts, argues, and advocates. To a lesser extent, you could use these verbs like outlines, highlights, and depicts if the arguments are a bit more broader. And here we have a vocabulary table. My advice is for students to build their own. So the first column we have the argument verbs, and we have our argues, asserts, and advocates there, along with many others. We also find our structural terms in the middle column. Phrases such as after, following, having established, shifting, continuing, furthering, and targeting. We also have these connective phrases as well whenever we want to link or compare arguments. If arguments are similar, then we use phrases like similarly, in the same way, supporting, or in support of. If they contradict, we might use phrases like in contrast, conversely, challenging, condemning, or while. Now these phrases should be familiar to you from the comparative unit in Year 11 and will be particularly important for the comparative unit in Year 12 in Semester 2. With these phrases, yes, they are explicit, but they're really important because they signal to the examiner or the marker that you are comparing. And as I said before, that's a really important component of the SAC and less so in the Year 12 exam. With that, it's important to know the differences between the SAC and the exam. So the SAC, You'll be analysing media texts or real texts that have been published, and comparison is essential. In fact, the SAC will feature more than one text, and because of this, arguments are going to be tougher to locate. Let me tell you, journalists aren't really thinking about their arguments as they write articles. They're probably more so thinking about their opinion and the upcoming deadline with which they have to complete the text. This is in comparison to the exam, where you'll get to look at a fictional text, and this is one which is made up, and the people who write this will have arguments in their mind as they write this. So it won't necessarily be on a media issue, and it may only be one text. So comparison isn't essential, whereas it will be in the SAC according to the criteria. So let's have a look at some examples. The first example is an opinion piece from Mikey Kale that was published in the Herald Sun in 2019 on the issue of pill testing. If you'd like to read the article, do so now and see if you can work out what the arguments are. Okay, now that you've had a chance to read the article, I'm going to go through and highlight key phrases which reflect what the arguments might be. Now with this, you might find it really useful to quote the actual arguments, or you might need to summarise them in your own word. It really just depends. Either way is fine as long as it adds to the fluency of your writing. So the first argument I have in regards to why Mikey Kale believes that pill testing should be legalised is the fact that Australians will keep buying drugs from dealers on the internet or in person. The second argument targets, the lawmakers and the idea that it's up to them to minimise the harm done to people consuming drugs. The next argument revolves around the fact that pill testing has been trialled before and that it was successful. Subsequently, we have a comparison with New Zealand, who have implemented pill testing, and the fact that it's worked. And our last argument is targeted at the Premier Daniel Andrews and the fact that pill testing will save lives. So that might be an example for a SAC where you get a real life article. Example 2 is going to have a look at the 2017 VCEA exam, which contains a principal's message from a primary school newsletter and a comment from a parent. I'll give you a few moments to read through this and see if you can locate the arguments within this article. So I've broken down Walker's, who is a principal, her arguments down into 4. The reason why she wants to act on plastic packaging. So the first thing she argues is that the school are already acting on environmental issues. And the second one, she focuses her concerns on plastic packaging. Argument 3 again relates to the actions the school are taking in reducing this. And argument 4 shifts more so to parents and what they can do at home to prevent this plastic packaging. Louise's text argues initially that parents are already doing enough, and then she goes on to attack and refute Walker's ideas. The visual depicts the concerning potential ramifications of this plastic packaging and links in with Walker's article. Obviously it would anyway because it's within her piece. So let's think about topic sentences we might use, keeping in mind the vocabulary that we looked at earlier. So our first paragraph is Walker opens her weekly column in a self-deprecating manner to outline the school's current actions regarding the environment. Here we've used the word opens to show that this is the initial argument. We've mentioned the tone, the fact that it's a self-deprecating manner, and we've used the verb outline before introducing our first argument. For our second main body paragraph, we might go with shifting to a more concerned tone. Walker continues by advocating her concerns about unnecessary packaging. You'll note here we've noted the shift in tone, and we've also used a quotation to identify an argument, and this is okay. In a text response essay, we wouldn't do this, but in an analysing argument essay, that is completely fine if it works, as long as it doesn't impact on the fluency of your writing. For our third argument, after addressing her concerns, Walker provides solutions that the school and parents can take to prevent further environmental damage. Notice how we have combined the last two arguments in Walker's piece together. This is something you might need to do, bearing in mind you are writing this under time conditions. And for our last main body paragraph, we might focus on Louise's text and write, in contrast, Louise begins her comment by highlighting the actions parents are already taking. You'll notice the phrase in contrast is used here to ensure that we are comparing between the two texts. Obviously, Louise disagrees with Walker. So, what are our key takeouts from today's episode? Well, the first thing is that you need to find the author's contention. This is the key that unlocks the arguments. Secondly, work out the reasons for the author's contention and add the word because on the end to assist you with that. Next, make sure you're using verbs in your topic sentences to state your arguments. Build that vocabulary and phrase bank to help with this. And lastly, compare and contrast arguments within your SAC, noting that you can do it in your exam, but it's not essential.